The year is 1519. The air in the Frankfurt electoral chamber is thick with anticipation, a heavy cloak woven from ambition and fear. Before them stands Charles V, a young man burdened by the weight of an empire he doesn't yet fully command. He needs this election, this crown, to solidify his claim to the Holy Roman Empire, a title that promises immense power but demands even greater resources. And for those resources, he turns to a man whose name echoes with a different kind of power, Jakob Fugger, the rich. Jakob sits across from Charles, his posture relaxed, almost too casual for the gravity of the moment. His eyes, sharp and unwavering, hold no trace of deference. He is a merchant, yes, but one whose ledgers dictate the fates of kings. Charles, a monarch by birthright, finds himself in the uncomfortable position of supplicant. The future of his vast, sprawling domains hinges on the whims of this banker. Jakob speaks, his voice calm, even-toned, yet every word carries the force of an imperial decree. He isn't negotiating, he is dictating. He lays out his terms, not as requests for a loan, but as demands for unprecedented concessions. He wants control over the silver mines of Tyrol, a monopoly on the copper trade, and guarantees that his family's financial interests will be woven inextricably into the very fabric of the Habsburg dynasty for generations to come. These aren't just financial terms, they are declarations of his family's enduring influence, a silent assertion that the Fuggers are not just lenders, but partners in power, almost co-rulers. Charles V, despite the immense pressure, maintains an outward composure. His face remains impassive, a mask of royal dignity. But the careful observer, like Jakob Fugger himself, could see the slight tightening around his jaw, the almost imperceptible clenching of his hands. He is a king, born to rule. Yet here he is, momentarily humbled, forced to bend to the will of a merchant. The irony is palpable, a bitter taste in the mouth of a man destined to preside over an empire. The agreement is struck. The vast sums of Fugger gold flow into the coffers of the electors, swaying their votes, securing Charles V's ascent to the imperial throne. The immediate consequence is clear. Charles V is elected Holy Roman Emperor. The celebrations are grand. The pronouncements of power resonate across Europe. Yet beneath the surface of this triumph, a deeper, more insidious truth begins to take root. For a crown of gold, a soul was pawned. The true, far-reaching impact of this financial servitude, the slow, silent erosion of royal autonomy, is only hinted at in the celebratory clamour. But what price would the empire truly pay for this gilded ascent? The answer, as we will soon discover, would echo through centuries, reshaping the very foundations of power in Europe. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us where you're watching from in the comments. To understand the full weight of that moment in 1519, we need to step back, far from the grand electoral chambers. Our story truly begins in Augsburg, a bustling German mercantile city in the late 15th century. Augsburg was a vibrant hub, a place where trade routes converged, bringing goods and ideas from across Europe. It was a city of merchants, craftsmen, and guilds, where social structures were deeply rooted, and a family's standing was often measured by their craft and their piety. It was in this environment that the Fugger family first began to rise, though their origins were far from the gilded halls of emperors. The Fuggers started as humble weavers, their early success built on skilled hands and a keen eye for quality textiles. This humble beginning stands in stark contrast to the immense wealth they would later accumulate, a testament to their relentless drive and ambition. The cultural norms of Augsburg's guilds demanded diligence, honesty, and a strong work ethic, values that were deeply ingrained in the Fugger household. Jakob Fugger the Rich himself was born into this world in 1459. His early life was steeped in commerce, a natural consequence of growing up in a merchant family in such a city. He was exposed to the intricacies of trade, the flow of goods, and the nascent financial practices of the era from a young age. His family's strict work ethic, coupled with their devout Catholic faith, formed the bedrock of his character. These were not just abstract principles, they were daily practices that shaped his understanding of the world and his place within it. During this period, Europe was seeing the gradual emergence of more sophisticated financial practices. Beyond simple lending, letters of credit were becoming common, allowing merchants to move funds without physically transporting large sums of coin. Money lending, though often viewed with suspicion by the Church, was an undeniable necessity for trade and expansion. Crucially, there was a growing understanding of capital investment, particularly in ventures with high potential returns, such as mining. This was a critical area that Jakob Fugger would master. Jakob's rise within this environment was not accidental. He meticulously built connections, understanding that relationships were as valuable as gold. He had an uncanny ability to grasp the flow of capital, identifying where money was needed and how it could be leveraged for maximum gain. He wasn't just a lender, he was an innovator, constantly seeking new ways to expand his family's influence. He positioned himself, and by extension, the Fugger family, as indispensable. Whether it was financing a new trade expedition or underwriting a local prince's ambitions, the Fuggers were always there, ready to provide the necessary funds. Subtle tensions were already beginning to surface in Augsburg and beyond. The local nobility, accustomed to their traditional sources of income, found themselves increasingly in need of ready cash for wars, lavish lifestyles, and new projects. The Church, too, with its vast expenses and ambitious building programs, often found itself in need of significant loans. This growing financial hunger among the powerful created fertile ground for families like the Fuggers. Each loan, each investment subtly shifted the balance of power, creating a dependency that would eventually allow a merchant family to hold sway over kings and emperors. The stage was set for Jakob Fugger to not just participate in the financial world, but to dominate it. As the 15th century drew to a close and the 16th began, the cracks in the traditional power structures became more visible, and Jakob Fugger was quick to exploit them. Rulers, once seemingly untouchable, found themselves increasingly reliant on the Fuggers' coffers. These were not just single transactions. They were a series of episodes that steadily chipped away at the old order. Early on, desperate princes and kings would turn to Augsburg, their promises of swift repayment often turning into delayed negotiations. This wasn't a problem for Jakob. It was an opportunity. Each delay, each renegotiation allowed him to extract further concessions, solidifying his family's position. Consider the early humiliations. A duke needing funds for a skirmish would pledge future tax revenues. When the time came, the money wasn't there, or the war had bled him dry. Jakob wouldn't simply forgive the debt. He'd demand something more tangible, something that would give him a deeper foothold. Land, mining rights, trade monopolies, these became the currency of delayed repayment. It wasn't about malice, it was about cold, calculated business. The rulers, caught in a cycle of needing money and then failing to repay it, effectively started ceding control over vital resources. The behavior of these rulers was often negligent, sometimes outright abusive of their own people and their future. In their desperation, they granted the Fuggers privileges that no common merchant family should ever have held. Silver mines in Tyrol, copper mines in Hungary. These were not just assets, they were strategic resources that powered armies and filled treasuries. Yet through a series of loans and defaults, these vital arteries of wealth, slowly but surely, fell under the effective control of the Fugger family. A king might still sit on a throne, but the Fuggers often controlled the very veins of his kingdom's economy. From our vantage point, we can see how these seemingly isolated deals were part of a deliberate long-term strategy by Jakob Fugger. He wasn't just lending money. He was building an empire, brick by financial brick. Every loan was an investment, not just in a ruler, but in the future influence of his family. He understood that true power lay not in wielding a sword, but in controlling the resources that forged the swords and paid the soldiers. The examples of this deepening influence are numerous. Beyond the mines, the Fuggers became instrumental in the most sacred of institutions, the papacy. Financing papal elections, for instance, gave Jakob direct leverage over the spiritual head of Europe. When a new pope was chosen, it often meant that the Fuggers had played a significant role in his ascent, ensuring favorable treatment for their ventures, including the controversial sale of indulgences. This was a direct link between the earthly power of money and the divine authority of the Church. The Habsburgs, destined to become the dominant dynasty of Europe, became particularly intertwined with Fugger capital. Their vast territorial ambitions, their constant wars, and their sprawling empire required immense sums of money. Jakob Fugger was always there to provide it. Whether it was consolidating their rule in Spain, expanding their influence in the Holy Roman Empire, or funding their conflicts against rivals, the Habsburgs increasingly found themselves in a financial embrace with the Fuggers from which they could not escape. These events reveal that the dramatic 1519 election, where Charles V was essentially bought by Fugger money, was not a sudden act of financial subjugation. It was the inevitable outcome of decades of calculated financial leverage. It was the culmination of a steady erosion of royal autonomy, a slow but sure transfer of real power from the crowned heads of Europe to the counting houses of Augsburg. The kings and emperors still wore their crowns, but Jakob Fugger held the purse strings that often dictated their every move. The stage was set for an even greater unraveling of traditional power. The Fugger family's power by now was undeniable, a thick, pervasive web that entangled itself with every major political and economic artery of Europe. It wasn't just about loans anymore. It was about an intricate, almost invisible control that reached into the very fabric of royal governance. The mounting tensions within royal courts were palpable. Monarchs, particularly those of the sprawling Habsburg Empire, found themselves in a constant state of pressure. Repaying debts was a never-ending cycle, often leading to further concessions, each one chipping away at their sovereignty. The Fuggers were no longer just financiers. Their influence now touched trade routes, dictating who could transport what, where, and for how much. Political appointments in key regions often required their tacit approval, ensuring that individuals favorable to Fugger interests were in positions of power. Even military campaigns, meant to assert royal authority, often depended entirely on Fugger funds, turning royal armies into extensions of the bankers' economic might. Inside the opulent yet increasingly strained royal palaces, discussions were fraught. Advisors whispered urgently, some advocating caution, warning against the growing Fugger dominance. They saw the writing on the wall, a dynasty of merchants, slowly but surely, eclipsing the power of ancient noble lines. Others, however, saw no alternative. The coffers were empty, the treasury bare, and the urgent demands of war or statecraft left them no choice but to comply with Jakob Fugger's terms. The silence of these advisors often spoke volumes, their faces etched with a mix of resignation and resentment. The societal perception of the Fuggers began to shift dramatically. No longer were they merely wealthy merchants, albeit extraordinarily so. They were now kingmakers, power brokers, a force to be reckoned with, operating with an authority that often surpassed that of many princes. This unprecedented rise generated a potent mix of envy and resentment. Other noble families, proud of their lineage and traditional power, chafed at the idea of a tradesman dictating the terms of their existence. Rival merchants, unable to compete with the Fuggers' vast resources and political connections, watched with a bitter understanding of their own limitations. Even the common people, though far removed from the high politics of loans and treaties, sensed a change in the air, a new kind of power that felt both inescapable and unfathomable. There were silent judgments everywhere, from the hushed conversations in the market squares to the formal yet strained greetings exchanged between lesser nobility and Fugger representatives. The sentiment was clear. The Fuggers had achieved something truly extraordinary, but at what cost to the traditional order? The psychological toll on the rulers themselves was immense. They were constantly balancing their royal pride, their inherited authority, with the stark reality of their financial dependence. The atmosphere in royal courts became thick with suspicion, a constant awareness of obligations, both stated and unstated, to the Fugger family. Every decision, every decree was made under the shadow of their debts. The very environment reinforced this psychological weight. The oppressive grandeur of royal palaces, with their vast halls and echoing chambers, now seemed to mock the diminished power of their inhabitants. Hurried whispers in council chambers spoke of looming payments and desperate negotiations, and far away, in the vast, silent vaults of the Fugger banking houses in Augsburg, lay the tangible proof of their power. Stacks of gold, piles of silver, and countless contracts, each one a thread in the intricate web that bound emperors and kings to the will of a merchant family. The entanglement was complete, and Europe was about to face a challenge that would test even the Fuggers' immense power. The entanglement was complete, and Europe was about to face a challenge that would test even the Fuggers' immense power. This challenge, an unforeseen and seismic shift, was the Protestant Reformation. It began innocently enough, with a monk named Martin Luther nailing his 95 theses to a church door in Wittenberg in 1517. What seemed like a theological dispute quickly exploded into a continent-wide crisis, and at its heart, deeply intertwined, were the Fuggers. The Reformation struck at the very core of one of the Fuggers' most profitable ventures, the sale of indulgences. These were essentially certificates issued by the Church, promising a reduction of punishment for sins in exchange for a donation. The revenue generated from these sales was enormous, and a significant portion was channeled through the Fugger Bank. Specifically, the Fuggers had a direct hand in financing the Archbishop Albrecht of Mainz's purchase of multiple bishoprics, an act that required papal dispensation. To repay the immense loan, Albrecht was granted permission to sell indulgences, with half the proceeds going directly to the Fuggers and the other half to Rome, ostensibly for the rebuilding of St. Peter's Basilica. Luther's public condemnation of indulgences was not just a theological protest, it was a direct attack on a financial system that the Fuggers had helped construct and profit from. This unforeseen ideological earthquake exposed the full extent of their influence over the Church, revealing a hidden truth that shocked many. The Fuggers were not merely bankers to kings, they were deeply embedded in the spiritual economy of Europe, essentially acting as financial agents for the Pope himself. This revelation, rather than diminishing Luther's cause, inadvertently fueled the Reformation's spread. It provided concrete evidence for those who argued that the Church had become corrupt, prioritizing worldly wealth over spiritual salvation, and that the Fuggers were complicit in this corruption. The political and religious upheaval caused by the Reformation pushed the traditional power structures and the Fuggers' carefully constructed network to their absolute limits. Suddenly, the source of immense wealth and influence became a liability. Regions that embraced Protestantism rejected indulgences entirely, cutting off a vital revenue stream. Princes who converted to the new faith saw an opportunity to seize church lands and assets, further destabilizing the financial landscape. The Fuggers, who had thrived on stability and predictable financial flows, now faced unprecedented chaos. Jakob Fugger, facing these immense challenges and potential losses, could not simply stand by. The meticulous planner, the shrewd negotiator, was forced to adapt in ways he had never anticipated. He continued to support Emperor Charles V, recognizing that his imperial power was the best bulwark against the complete collapse of the old order, and thus the protection of his investments. He diversified, seeking out new mining ventures and trade routes, trying to compensate for the drying up of old revenue streams. He also became more cautious in his dealings with the church, recognizing the shifting sands beneath their feet. This period was not a sudden collapse for the Fugger Empire, but it marked a profound shift in the landscape where they operated. It was a stark realization that even the most powerful bankers, those who could dictate terms to emperors, were ultimately subject to larger historical forces beyond their control. The Reformation showed that ideological shifts, religious fervor, and popular discontent could dismantle financial systems that seemed untouchable. The era of unquestioned financial dominance, where a single family could effectively own the financial future of kings and popes, began to show its first cracks. The Fuggers remained incredibly wealthy, but the absolute nature of their power had been challenged in a way no amount of gold could prevent. The direct impact of the Reformation forced the Fuggers to rethink their entire approach. Jakob, ever the pragmatist, understood that the old ways of financing papal indulgences were no longer sustainable in a rapidly fragmenting religious landscape. He pivoted, not by abandoning his principles, but by recalibrating his investments. While he continued to support the Catholic Habsburgs, recognizing them as his most reliable debtors and strategic partners, he also began exploring new ventures in secular trade and resource extraction, particularly in the burgeoning colonial enterprises. The silver mines in Tyrol and Hungary, which had been foundational to his wealth, remained crucial, but the prospect of new riches from overseas became increasingly appealing. Other banking families across Europe watched the Fuggers' struggle and adaptation with a mix of awe and schadenfreude. Families like the Welses, also prominent in Augsburg, tried to emulate the Fugger model, but none achieved the same scale or influence. The Genoese and Florentine bankers, long-standing rivals, saw opportunities in the shifting political landscape, attempting to fill the gaps left by the Fuggers' partial retreat from certain ecclesiastical dealings. Yet, the Fugger name still carried an immense weight, a testament to Jakob's foresight and the enduring strength of his financial empire. They were still the benchmark against which all other financiers were measured. The promised consequence of the Fuggers' financial ownership of kings became painfully clear in the decades that followed Jakob's death in 1525. While he had secured immense wealth and influence for his family, his deep entanglement with the Habsburgs and the papacy had inadvertently contributed to the very instability that would plague Europe for generations. The religious divisions, exacerbated by the financial pressures of the indulgence system, exploded into the brutal 30 Years' War, a conflict that ravaged the continent and reshaped its political map. The Fuggers, though still rich, found their influence diluted in a world where nation-states, rather than individual emperors or popes, began to consolidate power and develop their own, more sophisticated financial systems. The era of a single family dictating terms to entire empires was slowly but inevitably coming to an end. Jakob Fugger never truly experienced a moral or social fall. He died at the peak of his power, a man of immense wealth and unwavering conviction. However, the emotional victory for the broader historical narrative lies in understanding that even his formidable empire had its limits. His successors, though capable, never wielded the same singular, almost monarchical, financial power. The Fuggers remained a wealthy and respected family, their names synonymous with banking prowess, but the nature of power itself was changing. The individual banker who owned kings began to give way to national banks, state-sponsored treasuries, and a more complex, diffuse financial architecture. The Bank of England, founded in 1694, and later the Rothschilds, represented a new paradigm where financial power was often tied to the state or operated on a much larger, more institutional scale. The Fugger legacy is a powerful reflection on human ambition and financial genius. Their story is a testament to the transformative power of capital, how a family of weavers could, through sheer acumen and relentless drive, become the richest people in Europe, dictating terms to emperors and popes. It's a cautionary tale, too, about the transient nature of even the most formidable empires. Jakob Fugger built a financial machine that shaped an era, but even he could not stop the tides of history. His story connects the past dominance of individual financiers to the future rise of other financial powers, leaving us to ponder the continuous, intricate dance between power, money, and human destiny. The kings Jakob Fugger financed eventually broke free, but not without leaving a lasting mark on the very fabric of Europe.